2 weeks ago, 70 Christians were beheaded in the Congo. 50 of them rounded up in one part of the village, 20 of them rounded up in another, taken to a Protestant church and beheaded with machetes. Like this is not ancient history. This is happening right now. This continues to happen. 380 million ordinary followers of Jesus suffer very high to extreme persecution and discrimination because of their faith. In sub-Saharan Africa right now, there's around 16 million Christians who are displaced from their homes. In Nigeria alone, over the last 25 years, there's upwards of 62,000 Christians who've been killed because of their faith in Jesus. And the reality is 1 in 5 Christians in Africa are persecuted, 2 in 5 in Asia are persecuted, and 3 in 4 Christians are persecuted in the Middle East. And their prayer is for the comfortable West that we would get a taste of persecution to galvanize and solidify and refine our trust in Jesus that can so often be so fickle.
So you have Christians in the East praying that Christians in the West become more persecuted because they believe that it's actually going to help the Christians in the West.
That's just, you might be listening to this or watching this and thinking that's just strange. How can you be joyful and hopeful when a whole bunch of your people have just been massacred?
David Miers, you are an expert on global Christian persecution. You've spent decades on this issue, exposing the truth and fighting for those who have no voice. In this episode, we're going to uncover the facts no one else is really willing to uncover, hear stories the media refuses to report on, and lay bare the brutal reality of what it means to be a Christian in some of the most dangerous places to be one on earth. If people out there think they know what persecution means, they need to prepare themselves because this is going to be an eye-opening episode. David, I'm so glad you're here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what got you into this issue, and a bit about your background?
Yeah, really great to be here. I'm the pastor of a church, and I work with Christians in a fairly comfortable place in Brisbane, Australia. And I first got introduced to just the whole concept of persecuted Christians as an 18-year-old Christian. And I remember receiving a prayer letter at the back of my church and just being struck as an 18-year-old, looking at the comforts of East Coast Australian life and what it means to follow Jesus where I live, and looking at ordinary followers of Jesus and what it cost them to follow him. And so that's 25 years ago now. And I've had a relationship with an organisation called Open Doors. For the last 15 years, Open Doors has existed for 70 years. This is the 70th year of Open Doors, and Open Doors has teams scattered across the world. Open Doors works in about 70 different countries, serving persecuted Christians and seeking to strengthen the church. But the Open Doors started 70 years ago, and it actually came out of the ministry of one man. His name was Brother Andrew. He died about 2 years ago in his 90s. But he, off the back of World War II, ended up stumbling upon a need. He was a Dutch missionary. He was a follower of Jesus, and he began some trips across the Iron Curtain from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, and found many oppressed Christians who were living under oppressive regimes, who were hungry in many senses. And one of the things he worked out is certainly there was physical hunger that Christians had in difficult places, but the thing he worked out was the spiritual hunger. In places where the Bible was outlawed, in places where owning a Bible came with all sorts of consequences. And yet, from 70 years ago, he began smuggling Bibles from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. He never got picked up, and he had it's well known. He had a blue convertible Volkswagen Beetle, and this little car that he managed to hide somehow Bibles into the inside structures of this car. And they talk about, or Brother Andrew used to talk about his Bible smuggler's prayer. As he'd come to a checkpoint, thousands of times this would have happened in the early days, but also as the ministry advanced and as it grew into something much bigger than him. And his Bible smuggler's prayer was this: Lord Jesus, when you were on earth, you made blind eyes see, but now that you're in heaven, would you make seeing eyes blind so I can get your word to your children?
Wow.
Just
That's incredible, man. I've heard some of the stories of the ways that Bibles or pages of the Bibles were being smuggled into the Soviet Union, into the gulags, hiding them in loaves of bread, or, having a jerry can, but at the bottom there was like a hollow compartment and they would smuggle things in. And you just think, why on earth would a people, and this is before I really understood sort of how enriching Christianity can be for people, is why on earth would that be a priority? Like, why risk your life to smuggle a page from a book that's thousands of years old? Why not drugs or medicine or food? And you actually think, well, this gave people reason to actually exist. Without that, there's no meaning to enjoy any of the suffering. You might as well jump off the nearest high building, essentially. And just the hope that gives. And we're going to get into in this episode the way this is still happening today in places like North Korea, and how of all things, Bibles are being smuggled over. And it's just an incredible thing. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to really ask you, what is the broad sense and broad state of Christian persecution worldwide today? Like, what are the numbers? What countries are we talking about here?
Yeah. Persecution only increases since data has been collected in the last 30 years. It's increased year upon year. So right now, 1 in 7 Christians around the world, which is about 380 million ordinary followers of Jesus, suffer very high to extreme persecution and discrimination because of their faith in Jesus. In sub-Saharan Africa right now, there's around 16 million Christians who are displaced, who have been driven from their homes. In Nigeria alone, over the last 25 years, there's upwards of 62,000 Christians who've been killed because of their faith in Jesus. And the reality is 1 in 5 Christians in Africa are persecuted. 2 in 5 in Asia are persecuted. And 3 in 4 Christians are persecuted in the Middle East. It's places like Syria. In recent years, we even saw crucifixions take place in Aleppo, where followers of Jesus, like Jesus was put to death on a cross, were also called to be put to death on a cross for no other reason than that they belong to the crucified one. Open Doors, for I think 31 years, have published something called the World Watch List, which is a world-leading resource that tracks the different drivers for persecution in different places and ranks countries based on a bunch of things, whether it's violence is certainly one type of measure, but also just pressure on national life, on church life, on community life, on family life, on personal life. And so North Korea has been consistently number 1 for some time. Afghanistan was in number 1 a couple of years ago, just for 1 year. After the US had left, it became worse for Christians in particular, and so Afghanistan is still in the top 10, but not in number 1. You've got lots of nations, certainly throughout the Middle East and in Africa. Somalia is the second most difficult place to be a Christian. I think it's Yemen is the third place. Yeah, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, Eritrea, Nigeria, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar. So that's the top 13, and they are what would be called extreme levels of persecution and discrimination, and the rest in the top 50 are very high. But they probably, Open Doors would be tracking with about 100 countries around the world, and so there's times where a country will drop in and drop out again. And
it's incredible to think that this is so broad today, and Christians aren't a small number of people on earth. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions, over 1 billion, I'm sure, is the state of Christians. And we often hear about Christians being arrested and tortured or even executed. Can you share some of the horrifying cases of Christian persecution that you've encountered or you've heard of that stick out?
Yeah, one of the places that stands out to me personally, as far as just the violence, like, North Korea is number 1 on the World Watch List for a reason, and So much, though, of Christianity in North Korea is very much underground. There's about 500,000 Christians in North Korea, which is just phenomenal that there's that many Christians. And they're certainly sent to camps, and they certainly disappear, and they certainly have every type of freedom restricted from them. But the country that stands out to me is actually Nigeria, who are only number 7 in the World Watch list, which is interesting, but it is the most violent place to be a Christian on the planet. And it's interesting, it's a country of 220 million. It's 50%, it's probably slightly more than 50% Christian. And yet, it's the most violent place. You've got particularly kind of sub-Saharan, coming from the north, Fulani militants, Islamic extremists that are really wanting to kind of drive from the top of Africa down. The vision is that Africa would become the first Islamic state, like the first Islamic continent. And so the violence in the north of Africa is overwhelming to even reflect upon. The latest numbers out this year, we're thankful that only 3,100 Nigerian Christians were killed last year because of their faith in Jesus. That might sound strange, but that's almost half of what it was the 3 years before. It was roughly 5,000 Christians in 2023, 2022, 2021, and it's tens of thousands across the last decade or so of Christians that are being killed for no other reason than that they are followers of Jesus. And yet, I'll tell you one of the things that struck me. I love Nigeria, and I haven't been to Nigeria yet, but I've met many Nigerian pastors, and even at this particular conference, and I want to talk with pastors who have very different experiences from me. But to be totally honest, one of the highlights of this conference was meeting Nigerian pastors and bishops, hearing their stories of persecution, and seeing their tangible joy, hope, and confidence in the goodness of God. And that's just, you might be listening to this or watching this and thinking that's just strange. How can you be joyful and hopeful when a whole bunch of your people have just been massacred? And yet I think that's something of the Christian hope, is that we know that the grave is not the end. Like the empty tomb of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus is the guarantee that Christianity is a hope-filled religion, even if it's costly, even if you lose your life in a brutal way, like has happened in the last 2,000 years of church history and continues to happen to this day. 3 weeks ago now, 70 Christians were beheaded in the Congo. 50 of them rounded up in one part of the village, 20 of them rounded up in another, taken to a Protestant church, and the 70 of those Christians were brutally murdered with hammers, beheaded with machetes, left for dead. And so many of the stories that we know are only part of the story. And we are sure that there is persecution that's taking place, that we are unaware of the extent of just how bad it is for many people. There's one story that stands out to me from 2018 where a pastor, his wife and his daughters were brutally killed, and we know that the daughters were killed first, then the wife, all of this watched by the pastor, and then finally the pastor was brutally killed, and they're all cut up into pieces. And the only reason we know this is because there was a boy in the roof who saw this all take place, and who himself was saved and not touched by these intruders. But that is the only reason we know that particular story and the circumstances of what even took place. And so there are many stories we know, but perhaps even more stories we don't even know the details of how brutally people have been treated because they're followers of Jesus. Like this is not ancient history. This is happening right now. This continues to happen across the world. And yet the Christian hope is that like Jesus' tomb is empty, the tombs of those who belong to Jesus will be empty, and we will rise. And there's just this incredible, therefore, confidence that death is not the end.
All right, don't go away. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. What if you could be transported to the land of the Bible in a box. Experience the sights, the smells, the spices, the flavors, the people in a real tangible way. Now that is exactly what Arts a Box does. Now I was really excited when I heard about these guys because what they do is every few months they curate and craft a new themed box filled with authentic items from places like Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. And inside you'll find handcrafted goods, spices, snacks, soaps, jewelry, home decor, made by local artisans and small businesses with deep roots in the land. Each box will include a beautiful booklet or an explainer that guides you through the stories, the history, and the biblical sites connected to the theme. And what I also love about Arts a Box is that they're actually really affordable. They're perfect for families, gift givers, or anyone wanting to bring a piece of the Holy Land to their front door. So all you got to do is click the link in the description. Even for curiosity reasons, just check out the kind of cool stuff they're actually sending out to people. And don't forget to use the promo code ALI15 and they'll give you a 15% discount, which is super cool. And it also lets Arts a Box know who sent you. Now, by doing so, you're also supporting this channel to help me bring you more epic interviews just like this. Let's cut back to it.
Well, we've just had the 10th anniversary of a well-known beheading, mass beheading that took place in Libya, on the beaches of Libya, at the beginning of 2015. And it was 21 foreign workers that were working in Libya that were kidnapped for being Christian. 20 of them were Egyptian Christians. And another was actually a man from Ghana who probably wouldn't have called himself a Christian before all of this began, but he was given the opportunity to not be part of this group, and he said he wanted to follow the same God that these 20 Egyptian men were following. And so he put himself in the same group as these men. And what took place, I think it was probably about 3 weeks or so of being in a camp and being urged to deny their faith in Jesus, and yet none of them would deny their faith in Jesus. And so eventually, after the final opportunity, they were walked, you may remember it, they walked onto the beach in Libya in the orange overalls, and ISIS filmed and broadcast the beheading of those 21 men for the world to see. I can still remember hearing that news when it broke 10 years ago and being struck by the brutality of it, but interestingly also being struck by the reflexive grace, love and forgiveness of the pastor of one of the churches where the majority of those Egyptian men had come from. Like within 24 hours of this being broadcast, they broadcast something on their church YouTube channel that basically said, let me tell you the quote that actually came from the pastor of many of those Coptic Christians who were killed on that Libyan beach. From the Egyptian church to ISIS, we love you and have pity on you and pray that God may open your eyes so that you can see the true light in Jesus Christ. We're not intimidated by your threats. Death is a vanquished enemy for us, vanquished by the power of the Christ in his resurrection from the dead. We are not armed and we're not militant, but our prayers are stronger than all your weapons. And it was just a remarkable response, and it was just a standing up in the face of such horror with, like, imagine that. Like, imagine having, I think it was 17 of them were from the one, I think it was 17 were from the one church. Imagine having 17 of your church members who are off trying to earn some money to support their families, who get kidnapped, who go through this ordeal, and then the public humiliation and shaming of it all being broadcast online and just all that's involved in that within 24 hours there's a message of we love you. You're our enemy, but we love you, and we hope and pray you will know the peace that we have even in this moment of horror. And that image just stands out to me of how do I live life in such a way where I think for Christians in the West, you can easily have a comfortable middle class Christian faith that doesn't really come with much opposition or much danger or much that it will cost me. And yet to see that and just to kind of think, imagine following Jesus in a place where my name could be on one of those plaques, my photo, my keepsakes, simply because I'm in a country where the opposition to Christianity is so strong. And yet, here's I think the beautiful thing with the persecuted church. I think, the Bible speaks that there is one body. It's not like there's a persecuted church and a free church. There's actually one church who all belong to Jesus. Yes, there's some places where we are freer and some places where all of our freedoms are taken away from us and opposition and violence and so on and so forth. But I actually think the church in the West needs the stories of the church in Africa, in the Middle East, in Central Asia. It needs these stories of Christians who really it will cost them to follow Jesus, and yet it's worth it. Yeah. Jesus even said, if anyone would come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. I think in the West, Christianity has often been blurred together with some type of prosperity and some type of wealth and health and comfortable life and middle-class life that I think when you return to the Bible and actually listen to Jesus and look at the normal Christian experience for the last 2,000 years, coming to Christ, Bonhoeffer said, is a call to come and die. The call to discipleship is a call to come and die. When you come to Jesus, you're giving up your life, giving control over to him, and you follow him no matter what it costs.
Yeah, so it doesn't gel with the sort of modern secular, quite nihilistic framework that we're all existing within, because the structure of belief that governs the sort of modern man and modern minds is this is all there is, and therefore we need to sap every ounce of joy and pleasure from the here and now as much as we can. And you look at how this axiomatic belief leads downstream to misery. It's so strange.
That's right.
It's like you would have thought if you put at your pinnacle joy and, I shouldn't even say short joy, but just hedonism, pleasure here and now, feeling good, and you put that at the top of your hierarchy, isn't it strange that downstream you just get depression and anxiety and addiction to drugs and sex and pornography and food or whatever it is? But within the Christian mindset, you have as your guiding light, in a sense, a torture device, the cross, right? And you have something at the top there that is just so bleak, so awful, so terrible and just awful. And yet downstream from that comes the exact opposite. It's so strange. It's taken me so long to try and come to terms with this kind of the inversion of the modern thinking and how this just goes really, it's just totally against. Like you're saying, these Nigerians who are being beheaded, whose families have seen it happen, whose pastors have seen it happen, and they're not, they're not spending the rest of their lives just shut away from the world and just in misery, wanting to commit suicide. But the opposite, they're filled with hope. Obviously, they don't want this stuff to happen. They don't want their brothers and sisters to be beheaded. But it's so strange for most people to hear this and not expect that person. I don't know. Do you see what I'm trying to say? This is very much anti-snowflake. The snowflake generation. It's very much. We're all about trigger warnings and safe spaces and don't hurt my feelings. But this is not the case for the Christians.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we're in a really interesting time in the West. We've gone full steam ahead down the hedonism pathway, down the you do you be you, self at the center of everything. And I've got a friend who's an Australian pastor who's been in New York City for the last 20 years, the most secular, hedonistic, world-leading city on the planet, right? And his regular question to New Yorkers who've got everything at their disposal and have pursued everything and have tried everything is, how's that working out for you, mate? How's it going? How's it actually going? And I, mental health is real, right? And there's all sorts of triggers and reasons for anxiety and depression, and so I don't want to just have some simple answer when it comes to discussing some complex things and things concerning the brain and science that's outside of any of my expertise to make a professional comment on. And yet you look at the snowballing effect of secularism in the West, and we have forgotten God. We have turned ourselves into God, our pleasure into God, experiences into God. And how's that working out for you, mate? How are you doing? And I think in the West, and this is happening, the next generation have kind of looked, the Gen Z for the American audience, that next generation have kind of looked at their parents and the generations ahead of them and kind of gone, there's got to be more to life than this. I heard yesterday that in the UK, Bible sales are up 87%.
Whoa.
And that's been driven by the next generation wanting to get their hands on the Bible, because there's actually something in the Bible. There's a hope in the Bible. There's a story in the Bible. There's a message in the Bible that actually offers what this world cannot offer. It was C.S. Lewis who said, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable conclusion is that I was made for another world. And I love that, because you've got everything. You've got everything money can buy. You've got every experience you could possibly imagine, and yet it's not enough. You still want more. You still want more. And I think, and C.S. Lewis helpfully does that, he's tapping into just, no, we were built for more. There's an ancient book in the Bible, Ecclesiastes, which is a book that I think is it was written 3,000 years ago. I think is super relevant for our time today.
It's incredible.
But there's a line that talks about how God has set eternity in our hearts. And so, others have called that like a God-shaped hole God has set for the things of eternity. And we try to fill it with all sorts of other temporary means that might bring satisfaction for a moment. But the Hebrew word in Ecclesiastes repeated is chebel, which in English is vanity or meaningless or transient or mist. And it's repeated I think it's almost 39, 40 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. The teacher looks out at the world and he's like, meaningless, transience, mist. And it's not saying you can't find some satisfaction, it's just only temporary. And in the words of C.S. Lewis, well, if you find that it's not quite hitting the mark, well, maybe you were made for eternity. Maybe you were made for something more.
The book of Ecclesiastes, it's such an incredible, it's such a small book in the Bible. It's not many pages. And I think it speaks to the nihilism of the modern people right now. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are very, very nihilistic. Life's got no meaning. What's the point? And to think that these, you think that you have these original ideas. I'm beyond all of that stuff. Life has no meaning. But you see the book of Ecclesiastes written 3,000 years ago, and it's covered in it. And it goes into, you might best to not be born at all is I think one of the lines I'm paraphrasing. And it's like, what's interesting is that it doesn't sort of end there though. It kind of tells you why we're feeling this. And it's like you said, there's something else. And I think what we've kind of got right now with secularism is that young people are sort of landing up in that space where there's like no hope, there's no meaning, it's all just nihilistic. And I guess for a long time we've missed that extra little piece of the puzzle which kind of brings it full circle. And I think that's why Bible sales are going up so much. It's because it's an incredible revolution maybe that's happening now. I'm not really sure what to describe it as, but
awakening.
You could say that, yeah. It's incredible. And who are behind each one of these attacks? I think we got to identify the perpetrators of this. I think the media like to tiptoe around it, but I think we ought to identify who are the main persecutors of Christians.
There's a number of persecutors of Christians. Islamic extremism is certainly very significant with many of the persecuted stories that come across the table of Open Doors and other organizations like it. But often it's the dominant religion in a land. And so there are many, many cases of Islamic extremism, the desire in Northern Africa to work their way down in Fulani militants and herdsmen and so on that are seeking to make Africa the first Islamic continent. That is certainly the case. But likewise, there is Hindu extremism. There is Buddhist extremism, which might even sound like a strange type of extremism. And then there's certainly atheistic regimes like the North Korea and the abuses that are regularly given out to North Koreans, but Christians in particular, from that atheistic regime as well.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is Christian persecution in Iran. I spent my early childhood living there, and now looking at the stories of Christian persecution coming out from that country, I've been deeply moved, but also inspired. Can you tell me about the general state in Iran for Christians?
Iran is one of the two fastest growing churches in the world, alongside Nepal. And so the message of Jesus is attractive to the people of Iran right now. The message of Jesus is cutting through to people in Iran. I think in part there is a desire to turn away from the rule, Islamic rule and Islamic law, and that has fallen short in the lives of many, but it's left space for someone and something else. And so, thousands of Iranians are turning to Jesus, and yet it's illegal to be a Christian. It's not like there's a church on every corner. In places like Iraq and Syria, you've got this long history of Christianity, and you can still find churches in places like Iraq and Syria. It's not like you've got church buildings that are just turn up to investigate Jesus. They are happening in homes, they are happening underground, and they are happening amid the threat of incredible persecution, whether that's imprisonment, whether that's being hung, whether that's kind of losing all your freedoms or disappearing and so on and so forth. And so persecution is real in Iran, and yet the message of Jesus keeps spreading. Interestingly, I know that there's many who are outside of Iran who have been converted and maybe had to flee Iran, or have been who have turned to follow Jesus since leaving Iran, and are no longer welcome back, will automatically be imprisoned. I know that there's a diaspora of people from Iran scattered around the world. I know there's a desire of those who've been converted who desperately want to work out, how do we get back in? How do we actually get in and go do illegal things, sharing the message of Jesus, because there's just this great love for their people.
Tell me about the Christian persecution happening in India and in Pakistan and those kinds of places.
Yeah, India and Pakistan are both in the top 10. India's 11 now, but Pakistan's in the top 10. India's 11 in the World Watch List. There is significant pressure on Christians in India, and in the north of India in particular, quite violent. In 2023, I can't remember the exact stats, but the number of churches that were demolished and razed to the ground in India was it was over 1,000, I think. It was a significant number, and significantly skewed the numbers for how many churches were destroyed across the world in that particular year. And so that certainly comes from extremists, but that also, I think, is certainly there's tight government restrictions in India. I know that Christian missionaries and Christian NGOs were driven out of India in the last decade as well. Like there's this real desire to rid India of some of those Christian influences, which in many senses is tragic when you look at what many of those organizations were doing. Certainly those organizations were not ashamed to speak about Jesus, but at a very practical humanitarian level, carrying a significant load of charity and support and welfare and child sponsorship. And I even know of some of the restrictions at a government level in a place like Nepal, where Christian missionaries who have gone there to be Christian and to share the message of Jesus with people, but have gone and turned up as doctors, as occupational therapists, as engineers, and have come and freely used their skills without taking a wage from any organisation inside of Nepal and any government jobs or anything like that. But the tightening of how difficult it is for Christian missionaries who are first and foremost actually providing support and infrastructure and care for a country that actually desperately needs some of those things. So, so a lot of violence in India. Churches have been destroyed in India. Increasing violence in Pakistan. That's one of the things in the latest World Watch list that has been spoken about. I know that Christians are often on the margins more and more in a place like Pakistan. A lot of Christians work amongst the brick kilns under very oppressive regimes and under very bad work conditions. Effectively, I think one of the things that even happens, you end up in this place of a financial debt and a financial situation where you sell yourself into slavery, basically, at a terrible pay to go do some pretty dirty, hard work without any type of OH&S, and there's all sorts of injuries and accidental deaths that certainly wouldn't be in the category of Christian persecution, but Christians on the margins in a place like Pakistan are forced to the margins and live under great difficulty.
I've heard mixed information about the state of Christianity in China. Some saying it's growing very rapidly, others saying, it's being suppressed, pushed underground, Bibles have been edited and tampered with. Can you give me the state of Christianity in China?
The state of Christianity in China is that no one quite knows how many Christians there are in China. Most would agree that there's at least 100 million Christians in China, but it could be up to 200 million Christians in China because the church has continued to be forced underground. State churches cannot typically be trusted. Imagine running your church gathering under an official state-run church where you have the party with camera feeds in your church building with parts of the message that need to actually be consistent with the Chinese regime. And what it means is, yes, Christianity may not be illegal in China, but the vast majority of Christians are not part of the state church that's actually recognized. They're underground churches and they are hidden churches. And look, that's becoming increasingly difficult in a technological state. And so surveillance for a long time, but even in just the last couple of years, has increasingly meant that Christians are targeted, Christians are pressured, even the synchronizing of a number of people going to the same house at the same time and caught on surveillance cameras and people being pressured and pastors being imprisoned without due course and process. These are kind of normal things. And yet, again, there is this incredible pressure from China and from official regimes, and yet the message of Jesus keeps spreading.
It's just bizarre. It's incredible.
And you even look at when Mao first drove out the Christian missionaries, and the church has grown exponentially in that 70 odd years since that took place. And so the message of Jesus continues to resonate. The message of Jesus offers a hope and a freedom that is clearly not on display by the government and clearly not on display by those that are in authority.
Because within the communist sort of regimes, whether we're talking about the Soviets or the North Koreans or this sort of weird Stalinist, Marxist version of the kind of modern Chinese Communist Party, you can't have anything that your people serve that's higher than the state.
That's right.
Like it has to be Mao Zedong or Xi Jinping or whoever it is. And the moment you get a people that are no longer subservient to you, that are no longer fully complying with your orders, they're a threat. And so the way that the CCP has been really operating is that they don't care if they have to make their economy suffer. They don't care if they have to do anything. If any group of the public is veering away from their loyalty to the party, they'll cut them off. They'll do anything they can. And so there's stories of having to, they're changing Bible verses so that it's more within the compliance of the state. It's just incredible.
Remarkable stories even within the history of Open Doors, of some Bible smuggling campaigns. And 1981, there was something called the Project Pearl. Look it up, and you can, the Christians that were in China, again, this is a few years ago now, but Open Doors and Brother Andrew were smuggling Bibles in, and they kept saying, bring us more, bring us more. They ended up smuggling 1 million at a time. And that required some significant engineering and some significant creativity to get 1 million Bibles into the hands of believers in China.
Tell me some quick stories of how they were doing that.
Oh, they had to actually make a boat that would hold the Bibles, and the way that they there's some really great little documentaries you can watch online. The testing of boxes that would float, so that the boxes of the Bibles, the Bible weight wouldn't sink them down, so the right sizes, and it was a big project with a lot of people. I don't know how China didn't know it was about to happen. But that's obviously because all the stories have come out more recently and since that happened. But not necessarily an expert on everything that's happening in China right now, but I think it's remarkable to see the way that throughout history, including right now in China, the more you push down the message of Jesus, the more you try to tamper with it, the more you try to, not let Jesus be higher than our great ruler, the more you oppress at that point, I think the more it galvanizes believers to go, no, Jesus is worth it. We've even had teams from Open Doors in more recent years that have visited Chinese believers who have said, we are praying that the church in the West will get more persecution. Pastors, hey pastor, how many times have you been to prison? How many times have you been wrongfully imprisoned? How long have you been in? Has been a normal thing for pastors and leaders within the church in China. And their prayer is for the comfortable West that we would get a taste of persecution to galvanize and solidify and refine our trust in Jesus that can so often be so fickle.
So you have Christians in the East praying that Christians in the West become more persecuted because they believe that it's actually going to help the Christians in the West. That's incredibly paradoxical.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's actually helped influence an organization like Open Doors, because Open Doors quite specifically say, we do not exist to end persecution. I love that line because that jars. You kind of go, well, wouldn't we want persecution to end? Right. Don't we want injustice to come to an end? Well, yeah, we do want injustice to come to an end, but it would be easy to make Christian persecution stop. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, you know that Jesus you follow? Take him a little bit less seriously. Hey, you know that Jesus you follow? Just stop. Stop following Jesus. And so organizations like Open Doors, absolutely. We could talk about Nigeria for a long time. I think the government should do more about Christian persecution in Nigeria. I think the government is overlooking things that they could do more about to actually bring greater justice where they are turning a blind eye. Absolutely. We're pro-justice at that point. And yet, the presence of persecution is not actually the absence of God. Jesus says in his most famous sermon that blessed are the persecuted because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When you're persecuted, you're reminded that you don't belong to the kingdom of this world. You belong to another kingdom, a better kingdom where Jesus is king, where Jesus rules, where Jesus reigns, where there is a day coming when there'll be no more pain, there'll be no more tears, there'll be no more beatings, there'll be no more beheadings, there'll be no more martyrdoms, because we'll be with Jesus, we'll be raised with him, we'll see him and behold him. And so even the book of Revelation, the final book of the Bible, is probably the latest book of the Bible written at the end of the first century by the Apostle John, at a time where Roman persecution was going crazy, at a time where Christians were being taken out into the arena, where Christians were being mauled by lions, where Christians were being crucified. And the message in Revelation is hold fast. The message in Revelation chapter 2, it's kind of a letter that Jesus has dictated in some sense to John the Apostle to send to a bunch of churches in what is now modern-day Turkey. And to the church in Smyrna, Jesus says, I can see you, I know what you're suffering, but keep going. Be faithful unto death, is what Jesus says to the church in Smyrna. And then in chapter 3, another church, the church in Philadelphia, again, part of modern-day Turkey, he says to them, hey, it's actually about to get worse, but hold fast. The crown is coming.
Remarkable. It's just remarkable, because what I think is peculiar about, again, the secular modern messages of what it means to do good, or what we should put at the top of our values, it's very much anti-suffering. But the devil is in the detail there. So if you want to end suffering, the easiest way to do it is just to no longer exist, so to speak. And I think that's why there's a lot of like nihilistic, misanthropic people. Let's just not have any more babies anymore. They're only going to suffer anyway. And it's dangerous to walk that line of just abolish all suffering. Because if that's really your goal, if you plug that into an AI machine tomorrow, say, okay, well, great, hit the button, annihilate everyone, no more suffering after that. And so what I think is really otherworldly about the Christian message is that suffering is brought into the fold of the worldview and the belief that it's just part of, it's not seen as something that we need to just try and eradicate as fast as possible right now. Sure, it seeks to reduce suffering in other ways. It's not, help me out with the delicate language here, because it's not like Christians are sort of sadists who are trying to increase suffering by any means. But I'm trying to walk the line here of trying to define exactly what it is that Christians are doing. And I think it's like acknowledging the reality of suffering and not trying to fix everything in this world because they're not living in a paradigm where this is it. I think this is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and the Apostle Peter, in a letter he wrote that you can find in the New Testament, he talks about bearing up under unjust suffering, right? And Peter's writing at a time where Christianity is certainly on the margins, where Christians don't have some cultural majority, where Christians aren't the dominant religion by any stretch of the imagination. And he talks about submitting to governments, which is interesting at that point. And actually, hey, if you suffer for doing the wrong thing, well, that's on you. But you're blessed, just like what Jesus says, when you suffer for doing the right thing, and you entrust yourself to Him who judges justly. And He even says, you look to Jesus who suffered unjustly, you look to Jesus who did entrust himself to his Father in heaven, and who ultimately went to the cross. And so I think what it is, and again, I know Open Doors, and even on trips that I've been on, persecuted believers, their prayer request is not, can you go back to the church in Australia and ask the churches there to pray that our suffering will end? They actually say this. They say that's not our prayer. Our prayer is that God would give us strength to endure. We assume that suffering will always come, but that God would give us strength to endure. And I think the Christian story and the Christian message, just like Peter says, look to Jesus, I actually think we find the resolution in Jesus. For Jesus, the cross comes before the crown. For Jesus, death comes before resurrection. For Jesus, suffering comes before glory. But the crown is coming, resurrection is coming, and glory is coming.
So this is the interesting thing, and I keep bringing it back to the sort of more secular world, because I think that's the majority of people listening here. I don't think this isn't an episode that I'm aiming just for Christian people. This is an episode I think everyone can pull something from. And I think what we're having right now, especially in the sort of universities, in the primary schools and secondary schools, is we are trying to soften everything as though we are built for fragility. And I think what all the psychological data shows is actually that voluntary exposure to suffering or to difficulty and hardship actually makes you stronger, and we shouldn't be trying to avoid it with, again, trigger warnings and safe spaces and all this political correctness, which is very, very suffocating and is actually making us weaker. I think this is something that we need to be pulling from and bringing into the education and bringing into the cultural conversation. I think the Christian world has a lot to offer everyone here, and I was wondering if you could just sort of speak to that.
That's such a good question. I think, before I answer that question, I do think there are people who are increasingly in the secular society realizing that maybe we've emphasized the wrong things. Maybe we've gone after safety more than we should have. Like one of my favorite YouTube channels is not a Christian channel by any stretch of the imagination, is Yes Theory. Yeah. You're familiar with Yes Theory, and they say yes to things, but like their other channel is Seek Discomfort. And actually, and you watch their content and you kind of go, yeah, when they lean into those fears, when they lean into those difficult situations, when they go into places where they're uncertain how it's going to play out, you can see the way that growth comes. But look, I think, to answer the question, I think that what the Christian story offers is how to make sense. Like it's the biggest, take a step back and see the forest from the trees. And I think the Christian story, from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to new creation, I think helps you to step back and see, well, who God is, what God likes, how God loves, what God wants, and what God has done to actually bring an end to suffering in the world. Like the Christian story, broadly speaking, is kind of a 4-stage story of, God is the creator. He made everyone and he made everything, and he made us to know him and to be known by him, to enjoy relationship with him, communion with him, communion with one another. Like there's the opening chapters of the Bible is a Garden of Eden-like offer of paradise. It is the Garden of Eden. Like it's this beautiful picture of flourishing. And yet the Bible, I think, offers a satisfying answer about why things aren't the way they should be. The Bible says that things aren't the way they should be. And things aren't the way they should be because of ultimately how we've treated the one who has given us life and breath and everything. And kind of universally, this is what the Bible would say, and I think if you have any understanding of history and any understanding of yourself, everything backs this up, is, well, we're out of relationship with God. Something has broken the relationship with God. The created world does not operate in a way that God intended for it to operate. And that's not good. People are out of relationship with the world, out of relationship with one another, and ultimately out of relationship with God. The Bible would use a whole bunch of different words of what has broken at that point. But at the heart of it is, I guess, rebellion, of rebelling against the God who gives life and breath and everything, comes with consequences. And that makes sense. If we're on about justice, if we're on about rightness, righteousness, well, God is just and right and fair. And so if his creation is out of step with him because of what we have done, well, the consequences are significant. And yet that's the whole storyline of the Bible is what God has done in time and in space, in and through his Son, to bring an end to the destruction that we see, and to bring restoration to the relationship, certainly with one another, but relationship with God. And so the Christian story would say that Jesus would say when he walked on the earth, he makes claims that only God could make. And so Christians believe in the Holy Trinity, that there is one God, but there are three persons within the one Godhead, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And so when you meet Jesus, Jesus is God's answer to the suffering and the hardship and the misalignment and disorientation and brokenness and lack of relationship and isolation and however many other things you want to put in there. Jesus is the answer to that. Jesus, who is God, he has come among us. He has lived a perfect life that we failed to live. He lived perfectly, always loving his neighbor, always loving God, always doing what was right. And so he lives on behalf of a people who failed to do that. And then he goes to the cross and he dies a death that he doesn't deserve because he's without rebellion, he's without sin, he's without transgression. And so the death that Jesus dies on the cross is a sacrificial one in the place of others. And that's the offer of the Christian message is, you know what? You know how much you've blown your own life? We can often blame others for the things that go on in our own lives, but we also know that there's things that we don't keep up with our own rules, let alone any external rules from God. And the good news is Jesus has died in our place and for us, and he rose again. And his resurrection is a foretaste of a creation to come, a new creation, a day when tears will be wiped away, a day when the created world, things will be put back up the right way in the created world. Relationships will be finally once and for all among people. There will be unity. There will be relationship restored, but ultimately there's relationship restored with God who forgives us freely because of what Jesus has done.
All right, just a very quick message. If you're still watching this episode, chances are you're in the top 10% of people in the world who are passionate and care about this topic, which is why I wanted to remind you of today's sponsor, Artzabox. Now, we all know that feeling when we look out in our driveway or in our mailbox and we see that parcel that we've been anticipating. I think that's exactly the experience you're going to get with Artzabox. These are unique products and spices and food items and home decor that you're not going to be able to find anywhere else that you can enjoy yourself or share with friends and family. So if you haven't already, visit the link in the description, even just for curiosity, just to check out what's there and use promo code Ali15 to get 15% discount. Now let's cut straight back to the interview. Okay, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on Christian persecution on this channel is because I'm not seeing many people talk about it. Sure, within the Christian world, I think there are people out there who are raising their voices, but it hasn't really broken through to the mainstream audience. And one of the things I like to do on this channel is go to the fringes and find out what stories aren't making it through. And I've been horrified by what I've learned about the Christian persecution. Sure, I understood that in the early centuries of Christianity, it was being persecuted. Christians were being thrown to the lions. In more recent times, the persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union, etc. But I had no idea it was really that bad today. I'm 31. In all that time, all these Christians being killed, not once heard about these stories. Why do you think the world is so silent on this?
I think the world's silence on this is consistent with, interestingly, what Jesus even said about how his followers would be treated. And again, so I think someone who is a student of the Bible won't be surprised by this. Okay. And so Christians ought not be surprised when another minority is focused upon for the ways that they might have been vilified, for the ways that they might have been persecuted, for the ways that they may have been wronged by society, by another tribe, by another community. And so Christians ought not be surprised that might happen and Christians don't get the same treatment from the broader society. And so I think that is consistent with there's something about Jesus that the world hates. They put him to death on a cross. He says, Matthew chapter 11, the world hated me, the world will hate you. Matthew chapter 10, that's an expectation for Christians. And so at one level, that's a spiritual answer. I may not have the sociological answer. I do think perhaps in the West, again, flying some kites here at the moment, but I think the West for a while has been trying to shake off something of its Judeo-Christian heritage. And, it's interesting because the Bible is written in the New Testament is written in a context where Christianity is clearly on the margins. But then, what happens when Rome is converted? What happens throughout history and Christendom is interesting, and there's much that could be spoken on that topic. But I don't know, the last 200 years, in many senses, the West has been trying to get away from the ways in which I think Christianity has positively shaped the world. We have justice systems. We think about human rights, not because we suddenly thought of those out of some evolutionary process. I think because of the story told in Scripture about how to think, about how to value, about how to look out for the marginalized. And so in many senses, some of the outworkings of what is actually a Christian underpinning are still held on to by various sectors in Western society and still championed. And yet, here's the thing. These are the words. I think Mark Sayers, he's a pastor and cultural analyst in Melbourne. He talks about how we want the kingdom without the king.
Yep.
We want the fruits of the good things that Western society stands for and liberal democracy stands for. We want some of these good things that have actually come out of having Christ as king and having God's word, the Bible, shape who we are and how we think and how societies are structured. But keep your prayers out of here. Keep your prayers out of the school. Keep your prayers out of the parliament. Hey, don't bring your faith to work. And at one level, I think in the West, that is to all religions, but I think, and thinking of the Australian context, because Christianity has been, what does it mean for Australia to have been a Christian nation? I don't think it's ever been a Christian nation, but for a long time, the religion, the religious choice was, are you Protestant or Catholic? But, in the last 50 years, there's obviously been a significant increase in multiculturalism and therefore different religions that are here. And so I think in Australia, there's a desire to shake off that colonial British, English, Christian kind of underpinning, but also show some level of kindness and care and treading on eggshells when it comes to other minorities who've joined. Now, that's very simplistic. I know that different groups in Australia have certainly received much criticism and and I think some of the ways that different minority groups in Australia now are treated with care and respect, I actually think is a good thing. So it's not that that's bad and they should be treated disrespectfully.
I actually think we're playing Russian roulette with our civilization, because what you have within the Christian framework, and there's been 1,000 analogies being given, that we are sort of, the values that come out of Christianity, we're sitting on that branch trying to saw ourselves off of the main tree. And the question is, will those values mean anything once you've severed it from the tree? My answer is they don't mean anything. Because if ultimately in life, you've got a choice, okay? Either life has meaning or it doesn't. Okay, that's the existential question. You walk down any one of those roads, you get a different answer. And it plays out differently in how you live. If you want to go down the nihilistic Darwinian route, okay, where it's survival of the fittest and it's my interest against yours, there is no human rights in that world. People go, we're inherently human, you're human, I'm human, the golden rule. Well, the golden rule is from Christianity, okay? You can't have both, okay? And so if you go down that route, and if you want to try and shake off the Christianity of the West, which was the very thing undergirding its values, okay? It was the very thing which gave rise to human rights. Because if you have the structure of society and you have a government that's very, very corrupt, the reason why you can challenge that is because there's something above them that we're holding them to standard. They're not the measurement, something beyond them is, okay? The moment you erase that and you're the head of everything, the pinnacle of the hierarchy becomes whoever's in charge of your country, you've got no wiggle room, really, objectively speaking, as to why that's wrong. If morality is just the consensus of the group, the Nazi regime, exterminate the Jews. That's our moral conduct. And the modern secular mind will say, well, morality is the group consensus. Okay, so then you're okay with that? Well, no, I'm not okay with the Nazis putting Jews in. But why are you not okay with it if it's just the consensus of the group? And so what I'm trying to say is, if you try to shake off the religiosity of the West, right, the Christianity of the West, let's say, but you want to keep the things that were good about it, it's not so certain as to why it is a good thing to be tolerant of other cultures, right? Because the whole reason to shake off the Christianity is like, well, if we lower the intensity, then we can sort of be more tolerant of other cultures. Okay, interesting, right? Now you've shaken off those very values. Why are you being tolerant to other groups? Isn't it like your genes and your kids versus theirs? And so it's not sure how this is all going to play out in the West. That's my analysis. I've talked for long enough. What do you think about all of this?
Let me give my realm of where I operate and what I speak about and who I speak to more often than not. I'm certainly speaking with people who aren't believers, but as a pastor of a church, I I want to help people understand what does the Bible have to say about anything, and how do we live in light of the Bible. And I think for me, the teaching that God is king remains even in the uncertainty of where a culture is about to go at any particular time. And so I think in the church, I think within Christian circles, you can have some who run to the left, who run to the right, who actually see a political ideology and see how society is shaped and governed, that the number one thing in my life is to, run to the left or run to the right politically. And I think that what I want to encourage someone who's a believer in is to remember that God is king, that God is actually in control, that God is taking history to a certain end, and it has been messy lots of times, and it will continue to be messy between now and when Jesus returns and ushers in once and for all the new kingdom. And so at one level, I haven't answered your question, but there is an answer in there and a faith perspective at that point. That doesn't mean I bury my head in the sand and don't worry about politics and don't worry about how society is managed. I'm grateful to live in a democratic country like the one I'm in, where I can email or I walk into the office of a democratically elected parliamentarian and can actually make my voice known and can actually speak in light of my faith, and not forcing or demanding, but hey, look, this is what we value and this is what I think is actually good for the good order of society and things operating well. And so I'm glad to have a voice and want to use that voice. But also my encouragement to Christians is to not fear. Don't fear Caesar. Don't fear the caliphate. Don't fear whichever political person is feared at the moment. Don't fear society going this way or the other, because there is a certainty. And this is the final book of the Bible. It's written in a time of persecution where Christians are literally being fed to the lions. Society isn't operating that well when that's kind of one of our values, of feeding people literally to lions. And yet the message in the book of Revelation is hold fast. You will overcome if you hold fast to Jesus, because he has already come. And he has already overcome, and he's coming back. He's in control. He will not be mocked. And I want to encourage believers, people of faith, to keep trusting him, but knowing that many of your audience may not be people of faith and may be quite skeptical about faith, and may also be quite anxious about where things are going politically, about where things are going in society, about where things are going with Islam, about where things are going that seem out of control. I would encourage people who aren't of faith, to consider Jesus, and to consider the message from Jesus of do not fear. I've got this. I've got you. I offer you rest. I offer you life. I've got eternity sorted out. Yeah, if you follow me, it might become harder for you, as all these stories of persecution show. But the cross comes before the crown. Death comes before resurrection. Suffering comes before glory. And the crown, resurrection, and glory are certainly on offer to anyone, whether you have a Christian background or not.
Dave Miers, that seems like a really good place to end it. Thank you so much for making the time to speak to me. I'd love to have you on the show again. Where can people find you?
You can find me. You can find me online at Dave Miers, Miers on Instagram. Also at a church in the inner north of Brisbane, christrefuge.co. You can find our church there. I'm also part of another organisation called Good News Unlimited, so goodnewsunlimited.com. You can find out a bit more about me there. But yeah, I'd love to connect with people online and love to hear more of your story and maybe answer some questions or share some stories of persecution and hope. Would love further opportunities to connect. But thanks so much for having me, Ali.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Godspeed.